Welcome to the Sentinel Transportation Risk webinar. We're awaiting a few attendees to check in. We'll plan to get started here in a minute. Welcome to the Sentinel Transportation Risk webinar. This morning we will focus on reducing risk for your fleet with a discussion on telematics, distracted driving prevention, and work zone safety. We are delighted to have you join us. Today's presentation will be led by John Rouse, Client Executive within Sentinel Risk Advisors Division. In this role, John provides oversight, management, and implementation of all risk management programs to deliver an exceptional client experience. His desire to build strong relationships and improve the lives of others embodies the mission and values of Sentinel. You can submit questions during the webinar via the questions feature. We will allow time for all questions at the end of the presentation. Please note that this session is being recorded. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to John Rouse, who will begin the presentation and introduce our panelists.
Cool. Thank you, Jerry, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm really excited to introduce this great group of panelists for you all as we celebrate National Work Zone Awareness Week in addition to Distracted Driving Awareness Month. So I don't know how you all are celebrating today. I know Chris is wearing orange, so we're really excited about that because it is Go Orange Day. But that being said, I'm really thrilled to have an open-ended discussion with a lot of our partners here today, and just allow you all to learn some best practices, some things to consider as it comes to managing your fleet, while also ensuring that we have safety as we navigate through various work zones. Because I don't know about you all, but driving down I-40 these days and going through Wade Avenue, there tends to be a lot of those going on, and only occurring more and more. But that being said, one of our guest speakers today is, well, if I can get through the slides, forgive me. Here we go. Well, that's me. You don't care too much about me, but who we do care about would be Evan Sloan. So Evan comes from a background of managing risk, overseeing work comp and safety programs and initiatives throughout multiple companies, both private and public, and currently working in the public sector as the division manager for enterprise health, overseeing safety and workers' compensation with the city of Raleigh. And Evan's been a great resource for us to lean on, a good friend and someone that is well-versed in discussing data-driven decisions as it relates to safety, telematics, etc. Our next speaker is Chris Rossiter. Chris is the president of TMI Services. They are a line striping business headquartered out of Monroe, North Carolina, and Chris is a great resource for us as well. He's actively engaged with Sentinel and does a lot when it comes to just managing his own safety risk and fleet safety with his company. And so, Chris, thank you for joining. And by the way, great orange shirt that you have on as well. And I guess the next speaker that we wanted to highlight for y'all would be Dallas Owens. Dallas is another good partner of ours. He's the VP for Business Operations with Blue Arrow Telematics. They are an independently owned and local company here in the Raleigh area, overseeing a lot of just implementation, analytics, telematics technology for various companies across the country as it comes to the whole telematics front, and provides customers with essentially industry leading technology. So Dallas is well versed in talking all things telematics related. And then last but not least, two stars of the show, Dana Vorholt, Director of Risk Engineering here with Sentinel, who leads our risk performance group, and Steve Kite, who comes from a background working with the NCDOT and is leading our Director of Transportation Risk here with Sentinel. So guys, that was a lot of introductions. I'm really grateful for you all spending some time with us this morning, just being a resource and an advocate for a lot of our clients, prospects, partners, etc. And so, Dan, I really wanted to start with you, and let's just go ahead and get the elephant in the room out in the open when it comes to what carriers are looking for in fleet safety. Talking a little bit about insurance, insurability, but kind of in your opinion, as you're working with a lot of our clients and a lot of other constituents, what do you see carriers really looking for today as it relates to fleet safety and telematics programs?
Sure. Working with underwriters for my entire career, utilization, we'll keep it simple and making sure they're using them. It used to be a mentality. You can check the box and say you had telematics and get some underwriting credit, if you will. But now they dive into it. They want to have some accountability tools in that. And we've kind of shifted. We're in the middle of really a paradigm shift of passive viewing. I mean, these used to be expensive tracking devices for the most part. And some of that was because we get inundated with the alerts, and certainly some times have changed. And I figured out, working with smarter people in this capacity, hiring someone who spent 30 years at the DOT, the likes of Dallas and Evan and Chris, who utilizes these tools every day, makes me smarter to understand how to use these effectively and build some accountability. But with AI coming in some of those areas of really just emphasis and turning around systems, we've seen companies really, really create great programs by simply turning it on, if you will. So that's where I would go with that.
Yeah, and I think another thing too that we often hear, at least on our roles with you and I consulting together, is people assume that instantly you include some technology in your vehicle and it's going to help give you discounts, it's going to help impact pricing and whatnot. And so I think the one thing that I wanted to just kind of quickly touch on with you, right, is just because you are implementing technology in your vehicle doesn't typically translate right off the bat to savings, but I think this is where we're going to start to tee up our panelists. One, it's going to certainly provide you and help your insurability. But when it comes to pricing, and I think, Dallas, this is where I want to kind of lean in with you, right? Is like, it may not pay dividends right off the bat as it relates to just the insurance premium price, but it may certainly pay dividends in terms of fuel efficiency, monitoring braking, speed, et cetera, protecting the employees while they're on the road. Should they be involved in an accident, and they have, maybe cameras that can help advocate for them and show that they were doing all things, I guess, checking all the protocols and procedures in place from a safety standpoint. But, kind of looking at that, Dallas, what are you seeing on your end, right? You're working with a number of different customers all across the country. When it comes to the products that Blue Arrow is recommending, what are customers most commonly requesting? In your opinion, what do telematics data actually, like what telematics data actually kind of moves the needle on reducing claims and maybe helping save some money for the employers?
Yeah, I would say on our end, we're seeing the same thing as everybody in our industry. And kind of to touch on Dana's point, it's really moved over the last couple of years from track and trace, where is my vehicle, to obviously people wanting much more advanced analytics and wanting to use the programs more and more. And of course, the obvious, the in-vehicle cameras, all those sorts of things. But the big shift outside of like the products themselves is more around automation. So, I think when people started initially turning these switches on, wanting to look at more and more data, they did it potentially incorrectly. They'd get just overwhelmed with the amount of information they could get out of these things. And because of that, that state of being overwhelmed, I think it led a lot of folks across our industry just to not really get what they needed out of these systems, right? In general, regardless of what they had. And so that's really the trend is companies and public sector organizations that we work with are really becoming more advanced with this stuff. And the big shift is actually not even the technology, although that's a really big thing. It's actually the personnel involved in these programs. So historically, we interacted mostly with a fleet manager, right? Where someone managing fleet, they wore, of course, multiple hats, buying vehicles, maintenance, et cetera. Of course, it varies per organization. And now we're engaged with folks across, of course, fleet and safety, but also human resources and IT and executive teams, the financial teams, all sorts of different folks, because they're trying to figure out, how do we optimize our business with the technology we're already paying for? How do we leverage that for every different group in our organization? And in terms of what data moves the needle, you're going to look at, I'll give you a two-part answer. The first part is my cop-out answer, and it's the data that moves the needle is data that's actually used. And that's the big thing is, it really doesn't matter what system you have or what vendor you go with. If it's just being plugged in and not actually leveraged, then I hate to use the word wasting your, the phrase wasting your money, but that's essentially kind of the territory you start getting into. And so regardless of vendor, regardless of what solution, there's several good ones out there, actually leveraging the data for different purposes, whether it be safety or fuel efficiency or whatever it is, and holding drivers accountable for those things. That's actually what moves the needle. And that's what carriers want. And that's really what operators of companies want. Then my non-cop-out answer in terms of like safety data that moves the needle is the riskiest stuff. So Dana mentioned the AI stuff. And so, any high quality telematics / camera system will give you roughly similar data points, right? And in terms of which ones of those should we pay attention to, the answer is not all of them necessarily, unless you have the capacity to do so. It's which ones are the actual leading causes of accidents. And so I always tell people, hey, put your own hat on, like you're in your vehicle, and what causes you to be the most risky. And it's the simple things, being on your cell phone, which is a disease across our world nowadays of not paying attention. It's following too closely or tailgating, which of course drastically reduces your time to react to situations that happen around you. And so any system that's giving information around not just speeding, although speeding is still a great thing to look at, not just hard cornering or hard braking, but what's actually causing those things. And it's usually around distraction in the cab of a vehicle, and also not giving yourself enough buffer to be able to react when situations happen around you. Because even if you're a great driver and you're driving well, if someone slams on brakes in front of you for whatever reason, and you've not appropriately given yourself that buffer, then the chances are it's not going to end as good as it could have been. So it's really, we look at high impact data from the data you're actually really wanting to look at. That's a couple examples, but ultimately any data that is actually used is of course vastly better than data that's just sitting there in a system not being touched.
And I think kind of like off that, like my brain kind of goes towards like, all right, so you buy the technology, you put in your vehicles, you hopefully are tracking the data and using the data, but like where else do you see companies maybe go wrong when rolling out these programs? So Dallas, I want you to answer, and then Dana, if you have any thoughts as well, please chime in.
I'll give you a two-part answer here. And again, this is a general, there's lots of things that could come up, but I'll just give you kind of two general answers, and I'll make a large assumption. So assuming that the organization made a good purchase and bought a high quality system, so it's actually like a good quality system. So making that assumption, the two big things that we see are this. Number one, they try to dive in headfirst way too fast, and they're looking at way too much and trying to do way too many things, which really hinders their ability to focus to actually get impact on those things. And so, the crawl, walk, run, or the KISS method, whatever you want to call it, it's kind of the same thing, where we tell folks, especially if you're newer to telematics or newer to really being, proactive with it, you shouldn't care much more than about 3, 4, 5 things. And let's just focus on those few things first. It could be a couple safety points, could be some maintenance actions, whatever your organization cares about. I know this is obviously a safety call. So let's look at 3 safety data points. I know you're going to ignore the others, but let's start with those 3. Let's communicate this to drivers effectively so they understand our expectations of them. If you give drivers, here's our 12 expectations of you with driving safely, you're just not going to have the same impact of, hey, here's the 3 things that we care about the most, we're monitoring, and we're going to hold you accountable for. So that crawl, walk, run is absolutely critical. And that's irregardless of size of organization. So that could be, you've got 10 to 20 trucks and the owner of the company is extremely involved, or it could be 10 to 20,000 trucks and you've got teams of people managing the stuff. The principle applies across. The second piece is not clearly defining who has ownership of this stuff, not only from a data management side, but also from who is holding people accountable. And so if that is not very clearly defined, we typically recommend to also distribute that accountability. So yes, you need typically a single person or a couple of people that ultimately the buck stops with. But really, if you are not a driver manager, then there's going to be a disconnect. So you need to have drivers, direct managers actually holding them accountable. So taking ownership of that information is key. And as a part 2 of that last piece is, we always talk about, it's not just holding the driver accountable to get actual results from this stuff. You have to hold everyone accountable at each level. So if you have, depends on what industry you're in, but maybe more of a mid-level manager that he's over or she's over 20 drivers. You've got 5 of those. Well, you should be holding them accountable and comparing them to their peers. So they're directly responsible for their drivers, but also they're responsible as they have a total score themselves, right? So again, you're holding them accountable to actually hold their drivers accountable. So that tiered approach almost always, there's always exceptions to every rule, of course, but almost always is the preferred and kind of tried and true way to go about this, which is true about anything, by the way. And it certainly applies to fleet management and technology as well.
Yeah. As a safety professional, being in risk, we're always going to have a primary understanding that we want to do what's right for employees and send them home to their family. But I'm going to take that hat off, that uniform off for a second and tell you, working on the carrier side for the first half of my career, the first day as an intern at a carrier, someone told me premium with no profit serves no purpose. So let's not misunderstand, and we all recognize that insurance carriers are very good at making money. So this is a business. And at the end of the day, you worry about things with privacy, you worry about all these things. However, we have to do what's right for the employees, and the rest will follow. I will cap that by saying we all have taken for granted the fact that the most dangerous thing we do, and I'm even looking at Chris, who has a high hazard occupation. He's the president of a company that does striping on roadways. The most dangerous things that you will do is get in and out of that vehicle and driving. And we know that distractions are on the rise. We know that technology in our faces is there every single corner we turn. And that's where we're seeing the correlation of more serious injuries and accidents. So for me, looking at my point of view, creating best practices, I sit here and I learn from these people on this panel. And I want to share those with companies who may have some concerns with privacy or may had a bad experience with technology. It's changed so much, even year over year, that this is more of an advocacy to make that next step toward creating a more risk adverse company and mitigate those elements of risk in general.
Yeah. And so you talk a lot about privacy, and I think I'm going to come to Chris on this, and then Evan next, because I'll have a follow up for Evan right afterwards. But I think Chris, when you look at kind of implementing telematics and getting your drivers to buy in, I mean, how do you create that driver buy-in and avoid the whole like, well, Big Brother is watching me, I don't feel safe, I don't feel secure within my own vehicle? But obviously you're implementing a culture of safety at the end of the day, and really there to protect your driver. So Chris, dive into that a little bit if you don't mind, especially when it comes to the fleet and the workforce that you're managing.
It's a challenge that everybody's going to have because we as humans, we don't like we like our privacy, as you mentioned. So that's a difficult question for me to answer. I can only answer it from my personal experience because I don't have this fail-safe answer for just do this and everybody will follow. I was unfortunately benefited enough from an incident that we're able to turn into a protection of an employee that allowed us to get the buy-in. And what I mean by that is that, when we first rolled it out, Dallas had mentioned, the word accountable. Well, when a lot of people hear the word accountable, they think disciplinary, but accountable is a two-sided term. There's also there can also be a reward in it. So if you take it from your initial approach, you also mentioned about, maybe just doing 3 data points. And that's what we did. We wanted to see speeding, hard braking, and, excessive acceleration initially. And we would get those alerts, which Dana talked about earlier on, you get inundated with these alerts. So by focusing on just a few small areas, that limited our alerts. And most of these programs out there, whether it's, what Dallas represents or many of the other reputable ones out there, they have the ability to, limit when you get those alerts, and a certain percentage over a speed limit for a certain amount of time, et cetera, to minimize those alerts, because, what gets measured gets done, right? So you have to be able to act on it. So you want to limit it down to being able to employ that. But you can't just take it from a negative context of accountability, meaning disciplinary action. We do empower our, because I have, I do manage a fleet of about 63 vehicles, but I don't do it myself. I have, the comment earlier was regarding assigning tasks to those people. I have a few branches and people that are over those branches, and those people have access to the system to manage and monitor their drivers under that, so they can be proactive with that, because it's also very beneficial to catch somebody doing right. So you can take the data that telematics allows you to do that actually gives you a safety score and actually reward those people, build a safety program in there that will afford some buy-in. Now, back to the way I started this conversation, it was mentioned earlier about cameras. When I first thought about cameras, I wasn't sure because I was on that whole privacy wall and everything else, but I have the benefit of being in private sector, right? So, in the great state of North Carolina, I've got a lot of latitude with the law that allows me to put it in there. And if you want to work for me, you got to, this is what we do. That's not met very well from your employees, so you got to be careful on how you approach that. But we went ahead and put the cameras in because, as Dana mentioned, I am out there in the roadway. I have a mobile work zone that is filled with the traveling public. So, my dangers and risk are everywhere you look around. And we're moving that risk up and down the road, and and we're introducing new risk every second. So we introduced the cameras to our trucks for the purpose of benefiting ourselves, as a video record of what was going on in the case of a loss. This particular incident also had driver facing as well. In this particular incident, I had a driver that was encroaching upon an intersection. It appeared that he had the right of way and went through it when another oncoming car, which actually had the right of way, was coming. He went to veer away from the incident, did everything he right to avoid the incident, but it caused a single vehicle accident with a rollover. He was cited for failure to yield, you're running a stop sign, different things that they're would cite you for in a single vehicle accident. Well, we're able to pull that camera from that incident, and we saw that from the angularity of that particular intersection, the stop sign was actually facing the wrong direction. It was like an inverted Y, and then the stop sign was facing the oncoming traffic from his right. So we could show that there was actually mitigating circumstances that led to that. Not only were we able to save his driver's license because it would have been at risk for that, but by saving his driver's license, also save his job. Yeah. And we're able to take that experience and show how what we're doing to improve safety is also improving their safety in their ability to operate in their job in that field protected, because it's not a he said, she said, one-sided, a ticket says everything, etc. There's a story behind that with the cameras and the telematics, because we could pull the telematics and show he wasn't speeding. Yeah. He doesn't have a history of excessive braking or speeding or anything. That history shows that he is generally a safe driver, and we were able to defend him. So when you get that employee that is now an advocate for what you're trying to do, he's speaking to his peers on that advocacy level, and we're able to get a lot more buy-in on that. Yeah. So it's risk, reward, it's discipline, it's recognition, and it's that. And just Dana could probably tell you, I may be I may be too open with my employees. I hide very little from them, because every incident like that is a learning opportunity. So we share it with our staff, and by being open and honest and sharing, and not just from a disciplinary approach, you get the buy-in from your staff.
Perfect. And I think, Evan, this is kind of where I want to lean into you a lot more for this conversation, right? Because you've had experience working in the private sector and the public sector, and obviously with the city of Raleigh, there's a lot of vehicles on the road at all times, all days of the week. And so, as you're looking at getting driver buy-in, what do you kind of see when it comes to kind of really cultivating that culture of safety and implementing, safety programs, driver coaching, et cetera? What does that look like from a practical sense, while also trying to continue to get that buy-in from the employees when it comes to the technology that you're implementing in their working vehicle?
Yeah, absolutely. Can you guys hear me?
Loud and clear, buddy.
Okay, Great, great, great. Thanks for having me. And also, I'll be remiss if I didn't recognize our fleet management operations team for being the Fleet of the Year 2023. And so they're great partners, right? And so, we're an organization of 6,000 people. We operate well beyond the borders of the city of Raleigh, especially in our public utilities department. We have 4,000 assets. We're tracking 1,600 assets. We have 2,700 assets that are road going. So it's a big operation, right? And so, and with that operation, even with only 1,600 vehicles being tracked, that's a lot of information. As Dallas pointed out earlier, and also Chris pointed out earlier. But what we did was that we built it, and then the culture came, right? So we invested into um, Geotab via Blue Arrow. They've been great partners as far as establishing our telematics system here for the city back in 2018. However, we really didn't get really serious about it until 2023. And so what we did was is that we assembled all of our big fleets, so our big departments, transportation, parks and rec, solid waste services, et cetera, et cetera. And then we started to educate them. And we educated them by having them understand that these beeps that go on are beeping for a reason, right? There's some type of infraction that's being recognized by the system, but it's not Big Brother, right? This is an industry standard in the private sector and the public sector, right? It's just like having surveillance cameras in your buildings, essentially, right? And we don't have time to look at every single data point for 1,600 vehicles. However, we do have time to identify if there are opportunities. And so what we did was, and I think Chris pointed this out earlier, is that we didn't want alarms going off everywhere and all the time. And so to get engagement, what we did was when we assembled these, what we call fleet safety summits with all of our stakeholders, and it was not just your mid-level or high-level executive level managers, it was actual drivers as well. And we got feedback from them. And then we explained the program, and I got to, the ability to explain that everywhere I've worked, we've had this program, so it's not specific to the city of Raleigh. And this is how what we can do as far as showing people that we are doing the right thing, right? We just can't take your word for it anymore. That's not the landscape, right? Especially when it comes to insurance, and especially when it comes to even public reputation, right? So we just want to document that you guys are doing well. And if there are things that you can opportunities to revisit as far as training or get better at, because all of us get complacent when it comes to our driving habits, then we want to do things like coach up instead of coach out. This is not a reduction in force mechanism, right? This is a recognition mechanism, and this is a coaching mechanism. And so what we did is we reduced the amount of alerts. We reduced the amount of data points that we're looking at. We went for, out of the, I believe, 8, we did seatbelt utilization, speeding, and then harsh braking as well, along with, Chris's team. I believe that's a great, starting point, right? And then you can start looking at all the other inputs. And that's where our, then, we want to, say, okay, what's our baseline? So we have our baseline. Our baseline was 40.6. I'd never seen a score that low in all of my years of working in telematics as an enterprise. And so we set a reasonable goal of 75 in 3 months. And so the good news is, 75 in 6 months. The good news is that we reached 80 in 3 months, and now we're averaging 89 and 90 consistently. And so, and that's all credit due to every driver out there, right? And not only every driver out there, but every single department director, every single midline manager that that's part of their agenda, their meeting agendas. If there are issues that come up, what ways can we partner with city safety or their own safety personnel in their department as far as coaching opportunities? And what do coaching opportunities look like? They could be virtual, right? So, it's a go-to in the insurance standard is the National Safety Council 4-hour defensive driving. So they can get that done, on their own time, but give them a set amount of time to do it. Also, you can have real-time virtual coaching via Predictive Coach, right? So that's part of the suite that Blue Arrow can offer as well, in addition to your foundational Geotab telematics system. And also, you can go old school, right? So you can have ride-alongs with a more experienced, employee, just but what those specific deficiencies are for that driver, and then get tips from that person, and then have somebody that's going to help them be accountable and give them tips of how, they have higher driving scores, and give them, direction as well. So, when it comes to telematics, it's not one of those things where it's a luxury anymore. I mean, it's a must-have for any type of organization, whether they have 60 vehicles or 4,000.
Yeah, and Chris, I'm going to come back to you in a second, but Evan, real quick, I mean, so I know when you and I talk every time, it's a lot about data, right? Data drives the results. We want to make sure that we are looking at KPIs. I mean, you talked a lot about, seat belts, harsh braking, speeding, et cetera. I mean, so with your time with the city of Raleigh, and then prior to that, I mean, what data are you looking at? What data do you feel like that you really are able to kind of like get a full understanding and sense of what our drivers are doing on the road? Because my real question to you, Evan, is going to be like, how do you turn like telematics data into real behavior change and not just reports? Sometimes I've worked with some clients in the past, like, we're looking at the reports once a week.
Right.
Okay, that's great. But what are we doing with that? So is that coming from the top down? Like, dive a little bit more into that. And then, Chris, I'm going to come back to you, because I know as you're looking through some of the reports and just trying to really coach your drivers into best practices, I'd be curious to really unpack that with both of you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll probably be a little bit short-winded this time, I know, in the interest of time. But yeah, I mean, also when you're doing, deploying these types of things, and Dallas pointed this out earlier, is that, you want to have some structure, right? And you don't want to have everything deployed at one time. You want to have it so it's staggered, right? And do it in a tier solution, but also have not only, and this is going to be integral as far as your success as an organization, it's holding everybody accountable. It's having a policy, a consistent policy that everybody is abiding by, and then also having the acknowledgement that people understand that their behavior is being monitored. But when it comes to what data we look at that's going to actually have or influence behavior change, it's going to be the speeding, it's going to be the harsh braking, harsh cornering. But there's a feature in GeoTab that it's a newer feature where they have AI predictive analytics, right? And so basically, it can predict what of the factors, whether it be harsh cornering, harsh braking, speeding, seatbelt utilization, and Dallas can help me on the other couple of inputs. But basically, it shows what the deficiencies are for each driver, and it will it'll do a predictive modeling. So it'll be a leading indicator saying this person is going to have the highest likelihood of being involved in a motor vehicle crash in the next 100,000 miles. And so it's not just a general score; it's an accurate deficiency where you can strategically target those deficiencies for those drivers. And so when we started implementing that and started reporting on that on a monthly basis, when I say we at City Safety to our customers throughout the enterprise, and we start partnering with them so they can have more targeted interventions, whether it be the coaching, the virtual coaching, or even in-person coaching. And it's not just your general coaching. We saw a vast improvement in our collision risk scores, where we reduced our collision risk scores by more than 22% in the last 18 months. So this is another good thing when it comes to KPIs and metrics, especially being in safety. We usually rely on things like, your DART rates or your TRIRs, right? And that's been, for decades, our standard. But now we can look at other things, right? When it comes to vehicle safety. There are other things that we want to measure as well when it comes to efficiencies. I think, there are things where safety is, becoming more integrated into operations than it used to be. So, when we're leaning on not only our safety scores, but are we looking at route efficiencies? Are we looking at fleet rotation, right, for efficient use of our vehicles? Are we looking at idle time, especially, when, fuel prices are the way they are and our budget is the way it is, right? So those are the things that we take into account, not only that we measure, but also when we, impact behavior, but we want to impact outcomes as well.
Gotcha. And Chris, I lied to you. I'm going to ask Dallas a quick question, because I want to piggyback off that AI predictive modeling and some of those features that, companies are starting to implement. Because I mean, that's obviously one of the hottest buzzwords that you see across all industries is kind of the AI. And we talked about it a little bit at the start of the call, because Chris, I'm going to come to you after as we transition more into the work zone awareness. But Dallas, real quick, dive into that if you don't mind, especially in some of the features that you are really using and utilizing through your Geotab products?
Yeah, I mean, Evan did a pretty good job at really covering it, quite honestly. And I'll make one comment. I heard Chris and Evan both use the word measure several times. We have a catchphrase that we say, you can't manage what you don't measure. And so it kind of fed in directly what we talk about all the time. But the predictive collision risk is an important thing, as Evan was talking about, because scorecarding has kind of been the industry standard for a long time. It's, by the way, still very valuable and still has its place. A lot of the customers of ours that are leveraging the predictive collision risk also use scorecarding, and they use them really for different purposes sometimes. And funny enough, that wasn't the standard, 7-8 years ago. It's not been that long since scorecarding really took over. But the point of it is not just to understand how did my driver do last week, yesterday, last month, but it's to give a really good understanding of, okay, based on past performance, how likely are they to actually get in a collision? The one thing that Evan didn't throw in there is adding some of the more AI stuff in, like tailgating and stuff, like we've talked about in the past, is feeds into that predictive model. I'll kind of give you two stats here that's important. So the Geotab system is the largest globally. There's over 6 million commercial vehicles tracked. That level of data is really important when it comes to AI modeling, because the more data, the better the data, the more accurate the models can be. And so knowing that, we actually have several carrier partnerships as well that we've had programs with for many, many years. And we actually went through a whole project last year to compare predictive collision risk modeling against their actuarial data in terms of claims frequency. And it was looking at what that percentage was as a fleet, maybe per driver, and then what actual claims happened based on that, kind of side by side. And it was shocking to see it, because quite honestly, I was a skeptic of it, because like I am with everything, unfortunately, if I can't understand it, I'm a skeptic just naturally, and I'm way too dumb to understand AI and all its features and stuff. And so it was really eye-opening, where you see the organizations that have lower collision risk. I mean, the claims, I don't mean just the volume of claims, but the dollar amounts of those claims were insanely different. So we had one fleet, a medium-sized fleet, about 150 vehicles, and they reduced their collision risk a similar amount, by the way, to what Evan just said, about 25%. And their average rear end collision cost went from somewhere in the ballpark of $85,000 per claim, by the way, which they were having tons of, to it dropped below like $8,000 per claim on the rear end collision risk. And so it's not just stopping the frequency or reducing the frequency, but it was also reducing the severity, which is another thing that we talk a lot about. Evan talked about seatbelt usage. And we talk about seatbelt usage a lot. We've had lots of customers that have had fatalities in their organization, especially the risky customers of ours, like you think anyone on the roadways, obviously, DOT customers of ours. And so that's usually top of mind. So it's not just, hey, I want to stop them speeding, but also to the point of, we want to make sure our employees get home safely. That seatbelt information, drivers wearing their seatbelt has nothing to do, we believe, nothing to do with the frequency of accidents, but it will dramatically change, or can dramatically change, the severity of an accident if they're wearing their seatbelt or they're not. And so that's one of those things that organizations should care about. We very much care about it, and we're evangelists on a mountain, usually screaming at the top of our lungs of you need to care about these things. I know you've not had any issues, and that's phenomenal, but we've been exposed to too much for too long to not evangelize this stuff. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it certainly does. And Chris, I'm going to come to you now, man, because I know, as we start to, with the remaining time that we have, kind of start transitioning really around, work zone safety, work zone awareness. I wanted you to kind of unpack two things for me. One, as a president of a company that is meeting with your fleet team often, incorporating really what it seems like a lot of companies should be doing when it comes to, you have the data, what are you doing with the data? So Chris, I kind of like two-part to what I want to unpack with you, man, is like, walk me through kind of what you are doing on a weekly basis. What is that cadence when it comes to reviewing the data and implementing change? And then I also want to start to transition more into that work zone awareness, because obviously this is work zone awareness week, and kind of like what are you seeing when fleets are operating in work zones, safety? I mean, what programs are you really putting on place, both for your drivers that are in the vehicle, but also for your employees that are on the side of the road and just truly exposed to all elements, especially from the discussion that we're having?
Well, on the first part, I will be somewhat short-winded as well, and that's simply because I still believe that we're somewhat deficient in the latter half of deploying a good program when it comes to tracking the data, and that's the reward part. Catching them do right. It's easy to catch them doing wrong because you got all these alerts, you got all this data, et cetera, and coaching, from that data. But it's the catching them do right that I still think that we're deficient on. I think that we've improved on that because we are a smaller company. So, we do have to kind of spread the responsibilities across a few people, as I'd mentioned before, because I don't necessarily have one person that can monitor this on a full-time basis. So the being able to take that info, and what we did is actually our employee of the year 2 years ago was awarded that solely based off of his driving. Because his position in the company didn't necessarily put him to where he was going to be your high producer. He was going to be, the one that was setting the standard for his crew because he wasn't a crew leader, all these other things. So we look at all these different variables that go into recognizing somebody. And the one that really kind of put him on top was his driver safety record. Because, as we go in there, as I'd mentioned, try to catch them doing right. So we would on occasion go ahead and pop a camera on because our cameras have facial recognition as well, or rear facing, they'll have facial recognition. So there's a little alert in there saying, hey, put your phone down or pay attention to, this if your eyes are diverting. But we would also get in there, as well, and just kind of take a 360 real quick to see how everything's going. And consistently, we would find this driver doing everything right. He's wearing his seatbelt. He's paying attention. He doesn't have his phone on, 2 hands on the wheel, checking his mirrors correct. So using that info as recognition, I think that we need to continue to improve upon. But I still think that we're deficient. Now, as we transition into the work zone, our biggest challenges are the fact that I'm running, 4 to 6 miles an hour in a 70-mile-an-hour zone. So my driver habits in that case, it also kind of messes up my data collection too, right? Because you get, I could have this 100%, safety score because this guy never sped. Well, he's running 6 miles an hour in a 70-mile-an-hour zone, right? So, but take that aside, my concern is obviously the traveling public, outside of there. So the more that we are improving the distracted driving awareness and, telematics is input in that with, there's, when it comes to other companies, commercial motor vehicles, et cetera, we started this conversation off with Dana talking about insurance. And the fact is that there's not a single company out there that is considered best in class that doesn't have a fully deployed telematics program. Period. We talk about the insurability, but the fact is that in some markets, you're not going to be standard market insurance if you don't have these programs in place, right? So to achieve best in class, you've got to have this type of program. So it's an investment, not a cost. As it comes to the work zone, we would like to see the driver habits of the motoring public be more impacted by the benefits that telematics and distracted driving awareness has on our slower moving operation that's over there. Our distracted driving and telematics, et cetera, that's getting us to and from the job. When we're on site again, we're 4 to 6 miles an hour, right? So the all those driver habits are, we're teaching a little bit more because now they're doing traffic safety, not traveling. And their traffic safety, when we come to a truck mounted attenuator, which is affectionately referred to as a crash truck because it's the truck you want traffic to hit if you're going to hit anything. As we're teaching them how to safely navigate through a potential impact, always having your head on a swivel, an eye on the mirror, leaving yourself plenty of distance, how to react if there's an impending. But how do we reach out and grab that driver's attention? And that's where, I was looking at some other data and some other program. It's like, and there was a comment made about we only track the first affected vehicle in our data. Well, what good does that do you? Because that first vehicle is setting the standard for everybody behind it. So if you get that first vehicle to slow down, everybody behind them slowing down. If that first vehicle is getting over, now you start to get everybody getting over. So how do we get out there with telematics, with the AI? Because that's the other thing. It's not even AI, it's connected out of vehicles through telematics and other natures like that, where you can reach into their car and alert them saying, hey, you got a work zone up here, we need to move over. And all of the, the AI, the telematics, these other resources out there, those are helping my work zone become safer.
Gotcha. Well, I appreciate that. And so we got just a few minutes left. Mr. Kite, I'm going to want you to drop the mic with us, especially with your time and career with the NC DOT. But before we do that, if anyone does have any questions that you want to throw into the chat, feel free to do so now. I'll address those, and then we'll make sure that we get you out of here before lunchtime, since that clock is ticking very soon. But Mr. Kite, make sure that you are coming off of mute, por favor, and answer me this. All right, so you've been with the DOT for close to 30 years prior to joining Sentinel. I mean, you and I have talked extensively as it relates to habits, precautions, fines, jail time, et cetera, as it relates to, bad driving habits in a work zone. So it's going to be a loaded question, very open-ended. But Steve, I really want you to kind of talk on, what you've learned throughout your time at the DOT, kind of what you've seen as, best practices that both the employer on the side of the road and the drivers going through that can really implement to ensure safety with both parties. But I know you have a lot of key statistics that you like to ramble off to me. And so I really appreciate you sharing that with the crew for the last couple of minutes that we have.
John, thank you. That took you 3 minutes to introduce what I want to talk about. So I want those 3 minutes back in the end, by the way. But before we get started, let me transition from a blazer to what we're really here to talk about. This is my passion. This is where I spent 30 years of my professional career, and it's work zone safety.
For those that can't see Steve, he's wearing a vest right now.
They're going to see me now unless they don't have my camera on. And as you've already mentioned, and I appreciate you setting the tone, Johnny, this is National Work Zone Awareness Week. But what does this vest mean to everyone on this call? Now, I know it means a lot to Mr. Rossler that's on the call, and most of the people today listening in may be in the road and street business, but in case you're not, this is our kickoff for construction season. What we mean when you see this vest, this right here is a human being that's working in or near the roadway. So when you have your next safety meeting and your discussions with your employees, just remind them these are humans. These are not machines out there. These are actually parents. These are kids out there working, trying to make a living, trying to do the right things and improve roadways that help all of us. So, the season has begun. Chris's striping season's already started. I think he's already had 4 impacts on his crash, 5 now. So we've gone up to 5, and it's only April. I mean, we're not even into the heat of the striping and construction season yet. So please be mindful. But one of the things that we were discussing as a panel internally is, what is the most exposure for your fleets and stuff out there, or for your employees if you're in the street and road business? And the answer is all the same. The real exposure is the motoring public. That's where the real exposure is. My highest risk of getting injured, killed, or having to be involved in an insurance claim was on my way to the office this morning. It's not sitting in the 72-degree climate controlled office that I'm working in and having a webinar today. It's driving a vehicle. So, one of the things that we talk about when we talk about exposure is what's really going on in these work zones. What's going on in the work zone is that the average driver is not picking up on the fact that this small segment of road construction is uniquely different from the miles and miles they've been traveling on, especially if they're on vacation, or if they're a commercial driver that's been on the road 7, 8, 9, 10 hours. That little small segment of work zone could be uniquely different through lane closures, traffic switches, detours, temporary alignment changes. There's a lot of things that go on in work zones that take people by surprise. But the number one thing that I personally see is the aggressive driving. The speeding is now at a point where it's well beyond what I would consider the term speeding. It's very aggressive speeding. A lot of times more than 15 miles an hour beyond the posted speed limit. Of course, we've got less skilled drivers on the road. You know, we all talk about turn signals and the lack of turn signals. Turn signals are a very effective way to communicate to all the other drivers around you. Tailgating. I think tailgating is now the norm. You know, we talked about adding that space, that buffer space between vehicles. And people are, I guarantee you, if you out there, whether you're in a work zone today or not, if you leave the proper gap between you and the car in front of you, there'll be someone that pulls in there without using a turn signal, by the way. So you've got to realize, and you've got to train your employees on just how you set yourself up for your defensive driving. You've got to actually add more defensive driving into your driving behaviors. Otherwise, you're not going to have enough built in. You're going to be involved in a crash. You know, the cell phone. You know, there's many forms of distracted driving. I'm watching the clock, John, so I'll wrap this up here shortly.
Good, buddy.
You know, the cell phone is not just for phone conversations and closing deals anymore. It's, you know, it's finishing emails. It's people that are, you know, posting on social media. You know, it's all these things that go into distraction. And it's not only cell phones, you know, passengers that are in vehicles, animals, pets, whatever you're doing that takes your focus away from the driving task. That is what we're dealing with in work zones. But the number one thing that I want to really get across today is be prepared for the unexpected. In work zones, traffic can suddenly come to a stop. There's multiple reasons that it does that. Typically, it's in around lane closures or interchanges where the alignment's changed a little bit and people are unsure how to safely get into the interstate, so they make errors in their driving. And then what happens is, as people slow down or even in some cases slam on the brakes, it creates that slinky effect, and the crash is, you know, obviously upstream of where the incident occurred. But, you know, work zones are different. You got to make yourself, and you got to prepare yourself for, you know, focusing in on the driving task. So my message today, if you want to ask me one thing to take away from it, is train your staff on focusing on the driving task.
Perfect. Well, Steve, couldn't say it better ourselves. And as we approach the end of our time, a couple things. One, Steve, I'm going to prompt that kind of a question to the rest of the group, based on what you said. Is like what should be, you know, one thing that we should implement or consider really as a best practice when it comes to, you know, work zone safety and fleet safety. But before we do that, I did really want to just give Evan, Dallas, and Chris a tremendous amount of credit for spending time out of your morning to talk to a lot of our partners and friends here in the industry, and then the clients that we advocate on behalf of and represent. So thank you three for being experts. Thank you three for what you do as it relates to, you know, implementing best practices, being consultants. I know you all are involved in various boards and the clients that you work with as well. So as we kind of go through, with brevity being our friend, I'll go Chris, Dallas, Evan in alphabetical order. But Chris, you know, as you think about like one thing the folks on the call should, you know, really get out of today's discussion, what is one thing, like one best practice that you would, you know, strongly recommend for all of those that are on the call that are also actively involved in work zones and or managing large fleets?
Well, I'm actually in the middle there, John. And the reason I say that, obviously, is because telematics has gone such a long way from the first time that it was just a tracking device. Because I remember when it was just a tracking device 25 years ago when I first deployed these things, you know, and they've come a long way. And yes, you can improve your safety program through the use of that. And we've advanced so far. And a lot more with the AI predictive index. That's a new, you know, that's coming alive. So you're going to see that continue to grow. You know, but you know, as Steve mentioned, you know, work zones. That's where that's where I'm at. You know, I'm in those work zones. But my number one risk inside those work zones is that distracted driver. You know, so aggressive driving is a problem. You know, the tailgating, reactive time, et cetera, all of those happen. But a lot of times those are preempted by a distracted driver. who's just simply not paying attention. So, with the over 3,000 deaths in a work zone, it's a lot of those are the motoring public simply not paying attention. So my message is put down the phone and pay attention to what you're doing. When you're driving a vehicle, actually drive the vehicle. And if you need discipline help the way that I did, a lot of our smartphones have those devices where they can go into driver mode. They're connected to your onboard system, and they don't allow you to have that communication. It goes into driver mode, and you don't get to unlock the screen unless you purposely try to and allow yourself that discipline to no longer want to lean towards that. Set the example yourself. So, I'm not one who's going to sit here and say, stop being distracted if I'm not willing to stop being distracted myself. And one of my employees taught me that. So pay attention to what you're doing when you're driving up and down the road. That'll take care of work zone safety itself.
Yeah, and Dallas, I think, obviously I prompted that question to Chris, but I think for you and Evan, as we finish up, there's a really good question from the audience, and this will be what we finish on. But, when accidents occur, claims inevitably follow. What would be your perspective on leveraging telematics for early intervention, specifically triggering a prompt adjuster response to the scene to capture critical information, inspect vehicles, build rapport with involved parties, and where liability is apparent, pursue opportunities for early resolution? So I think this is very much more like insurance related, but I think, as we kind of think about early adoption of telematics, certainly being best practices, what are your thoughts, and kind of help finish this up, and then Evan, we'll piggyback off of that and send over you to end the call for us.
Yeah, so I had a great answer queued up for your previous question, but I'll ignore that. It's okay.
Do that then. But, we'll send this. We'll tee this up to.
I'm kidding. But so we have a simple answer there, and it's you got to ditch the pen and paper post accident. Assuming the accident's already happened, pen and paper is kind of the standard. We think you should ditch it, is our personal opinion. Our program and several other programs out there have a digital way to capture that information, to actually walk a driver through that workflow to capture all the relevant information, to get a true narrative, which then pairs that with the actual data that happened, telematics, camera information. And the point of all that is we need to tell the most accurate story humanly possible to exonerate our driver, because guess what? Who they hit or who hit them is telling their own story. And everyone's seen enough of this to know that those stories are typically wildly different. And we want to make sure that we have 10 times the evidence that other story has, so we can actually back that up and again try to exonerate our driver and not have a false claim against us. When you have City of Raleigh or TMI on the side of your trucks, that just says dollar signs to people, and so we want to avoid that as much as humanly possible. And so we believe in automated ways to capture that information and walking drivers through a workflow that's simple to capture the correct information. And I'll throw one last bit. Do not admit fault. Good Lord, how many times we've had this, and I don't know if that's a standard, industry recommendation, but we certainly tell people, please do not admit fault. Just tell the story as is and tell as little as possible, and we're going to capture the rest of it via those post-accident forms. So that's just a little tidbit.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. Evan, you have the privilege of dropping the microphone as we get off the call. So I'm going to let you just take it. I've talked about so many different topics and questions that you can present, but I know that you have something that you can really let us leave home with in terms of best practices, exonerating our drivers, etc. So the floor is yours, my friend.
Okay, well, thank you so much, John, and thanks for having me in the study. We appreciate it. It's not a coincidence that, it's the Distracted Driving Awareness Month. Also, it's also NWZAW, National Work Zone Awareness Week, right? So that intersection, that overlap is for a reason. And so in my business, we have work zones everywhere, right? And so that involves police officers, transportation, public utilities, right? Because we're an expanding city. So a lot of our infrastructure is expanding or improving. And so, and if I look at the stats, just from 2024, we had 899 people die in work zones, 82 highway worker occupational fatalities. 705 drivers and their passengers die, and then 39,000 injuries in work zones as well. And so if there's just one that could be avoided, especially when it comes to fatalities, and I believe that Chris, touched on this before, and also Steve as well. These are real people. And, in my job, I've had the conversation with widows and their children explaining why their husbands or their fathers are not going to be coming home ever again, and how this happened on the job, and how we can take care of them moving forward as best we can. And so I think it's one of those situations where, we do take it seriously. I think if we talk about the telematics piece, and Dallas touched on this before, it's not only the event capturing when it comes to the reconstruction of the accident, where you can see the G-forces and all that stuff, and you can see the trip, so you can actually, put down the pen and paper, and then you can get the real narrative via Geotab. However, it's what led to that point, right? So what makes you a responsible employer versus a negligent employer, right? And so my path of doing, commercial general liability and auto liability for national companies, the most important part was not the event itself, but what do we do as an organization to prevent that incident from happening in the first place, or to mitigate it, right, when it comes to the consequences. So I just wanted people to take that, as far as a takeaway, when considering not only themselves getting in their vehicles, but their teams getting in the vehicles, whether it be those vehicles that have logos of their companies, their organizations, or their personal vehicles.
Perfect. Well, I think that was a beautiful way to end today's discussion and let everyone get on to their lunch hours. But really, I think in summary, what I got from this in the notes that I took is, telematics can certainly help from an insurability standpoint, but more importantly, it's going to help as we continue to go into this crazy world that we live in. I mean, I know in past discussions with this group, we've talked a lot about nuclear verdicts. Dallas, you brought up a great point when it comes to, when someone sees the name of a company on the side of a vehicle and you're involved in an accident, it's like, how can we tell that story to truly exonerate, but further just protect our employees while we're on the road? And of course, we talked a lot about best practices as it relates to work zone safety. So Chris, Dallas, Evan, Dana, Steve, can't express my gratitude enough for you all taking some time and just chatting with our constituents on best practices, what you all see. And I know that if they have any more questions, we can certainly help facilitate that and get anyone to the right parties with anything else that comes as a result of today's discussion. But one more time, I appreciate everyone for joining this webinar this morning, and certainly we'll have more to come. But again, for you guys being panelists and being industry experts, kudos to you. We can't do what we do without being able to lean on you for a lot of this support. So thank you very much again.
Thank you for putting this together.
Thanks, John.
Awesome. Well, other than that, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll have a recording. We'll send this out after we are all done and the recording finishes. So y'all have a good rest of your day, and we'll talk to you soon. Thank you.
Stay safe.